Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about joining and separating objects in Blender. I've combined a couple of things in this post just because joining objects, as in something you can only edit its components in edit mode, but also talk about parenting objects to other objects to follow their animation, whether it's location or scale or rotation. So let's get started. Let's start by adding a couple of meshes. We can do round cube. Of course, I want it to look like a circle, so I'm going to change this into 1. I keep saying circle, but I mean sphere. I talk in 2D terms most of the time, even though we're in 3D mode right now. And then let's duplicate it with Shift D on the x-axis, move it with G, and then hit X to isolate the axis that you want to move on. And now select both of these and hit Command or Control J on a Windows and join them. The first thing that you're going to notice is that they're going to have the outlines of the active object because now we only have one. And even if I toggle this, I only have one mesh. If I undo this right now, we can see that this is not active, it's just selected. And over here as well, we can see that there are 2 different objects with one active. And whatever you want to join into has to be the active object. So if I go over here and I called this cloud, and now I join the geometry, if I hit Command, I can switch between the active when I'm clicking over here. If I had the active as the round cube, see what happens. When I hit Command J, the round cube that I haven't renamed is the one that is the geometry now. So let's say you have renamed something and you want to join other objects into it, then just keep it as the active object and that will make it the name of the object. If I hit Command J, now I get to keep the cloud renaming. Now it's not a big problem if you join into the wrong objects and then rename it, but sometimes if you have a lot of objects and you decide suddenly to join, let's say 5 objects into one, then you will try to look for it because you have joined into the wrong one, you won't find it. That is, of course, if you rename your stuff and you organize it. I tend to do the majority of the time just because I append stuff from other projects, from other Blender files, and renaming all of these help me understand what material I'm trying to append or what objects I'm trying to append. If I call the material 1 or I kept it as is when it's first created, then when I want to append it, I will have to just test out a few things or open that file in order to know what parts I wanted to append. So it's better if you rename everything, and with joining, just make sure that you're joining into the things that you have renamed, or just pay attention to what you're joining and where you're joining it into. I'm just trying to make your lives easier. That's the main purpose of these tutorials that I'm making for the A to Z tutorial, is to make everyone's life in Blender much easier. They're not necessarily beginner tutorials, but they're tutorials for people who have already been creating in Blender but want to streamline their process or facilitate certain things that could take a long time, like the duplicating objects and copying data part. I really wanted to include these kind of tutorials in between bigger tutorials like inflating things or hair particles or the geometry nodes one, because I think these are as important as any other tutorial that is out there in Blender. Unfortunately, they're the least watched when I go and look up tutorials for Blender on YouTube. I'm finding that these kind of tutorials that are really helpful and have details on how to use the UI of Blender or the software itself, because everybody just wants to know the bigger things that will help them get projects out. But I mean, we don't want just projects out. We want projects that are fast, that are efficient, that are easy to recreate, just because they're not tedious from the amount of work that we're spending on them because of lack of information. Okay, tangent over. Let's now select some of the joined objects, or learn how to select separate objects in a joined mesh. And let's also learn how to separate them. When you have a joined mesh, in order to edit them, you're going to have to go into edit mode. So hit tab, go into edit mode. Usually those are all selected. So if you hit A, you can select everything inside of edit mode. And you can definitely separate them even if they're all selected. So let's say you change your mind, you don't want to join these two objects. If you hit P for separate, you're gonna get either separate by selection or by material or by loose parts. Because everything is selected, then we're gonna choose by loose parts. And you're immediately going to see that this is out of edit mode and it's selected, but it's not the active one. So the active one is what we are inside of its edit mode. So if I hit tab to go out of edit mode, we now have two separate objects. But let's say you have a more complicated setup. And this is something that I've dealt with before. Let's say you have a tree, for instance, or a plant that you have downloaded from any website, either by purchasing it or just downloading it for free. You're not going to always get something already separate and ready for you to use the way you want it. You just like the visual of it, and then you have to separate it or edit it if you need certain parts of it. So what I do is use select linked. If I hover over this, hit L to select or select the linked parts of this entire object, and hit P, separate by selection. And if I go out of edit mode, then I have two different objects. But I never use by selection this way. The majority of the time, it's by an actual selection. So let's say I am selecting this part and I want to separate it. I can definitely do P, separate by selection. And if I go out of edit mode and select this, I can move it and it's separated from the original mesh. Let's undo all of that and show you a real example of how I would use this. Let's say I have this as selected as a separate material. Let's actually go to the materials, add a new slot for the materials. New, let's make this black. Also, let's view by material. This way we can actually see what is happening. Now everything is black, but let's say I want only the selection. But what is going to be the material for the rest of the object? So I'm gonna have to add another material slot, assign a new material. Let's make it the top material by moving it like so, because I want this to be the main material and this is to be the secondary. And now for the main, let's actually delete this so this is applied to the entire thing. And then let's again add a material slot. We don't have to add a new material because we already added it. It's just that we removed the slot. So this has nothing to stick to. Now let's add the secondary material and go into edit mode. Select the part that you want to color. Actually, I want this entire part to be colored with the black. And now I have two different materials on this. So let's say I want to select this part and make a frame because I want this to look as if it's a screen, as if this is a TV or something unconventional, definitely. But let's say I want to add a frame to it. So right now I can hit Shift D to duplicate. I have a duplicate of those lines that I want to create a frame of. And then let's hit Escape before you click the mouse, because that will duplicate it, but it'll keep its original position. And then if I hit P, separate by selection, now I have a separate selection for the frame or a separate object for the frame. I can convert this into a curve, go to the curve properties or the object data properties, go to the depth and increase it a little bit. And now I have a frame that follows the exact lines of this screen. So this is a real example of how I would use separate by selection. Let's change this so we can actually see what is happening. Okay, so you can see the frame now and it's created as a separate object. But let's say I want to rejoin it with everything else because I've created it. I like that it has a different material than everything else. I can just hit Shift, click on this. It's going to be the active and then join into this. Well, it won't join it because it's a curve. So we have to convert it into a mesh before we do anything to it. Convert to mesh and then select this part, Command join. But now we're starting to have a problem. This should have kept its material, but the reason why it didn't is because it wasn't colored with a material. That was just the default color. So let's undo that. Go into the materials tab, add a material, keep it as white. Also, I have these named as cloud. Don't worry about that. It doesn't really matter. Or let's actually call it screen, just so we know what we're creating. Now click on this and shift and click on the original object that we want to join into and hit Command J. And you immediately see that we have a third slot for the materials because this had a separate material. And so it added that material to the slots, which is going to help us with our next point. If I go into edit mode and say, I don't really like that I have all of these objects inside of this one object and I want to separate them by material. So if I select everything, hit P and then separate by material, I'm going to have different objects based on the material. Because I had 3 materials, it's going to create 3 different objects. And if I go out of edit mode, now I have this as a separate object, this as a separate object, and finally the frame as a separate object. So these are the 3 ways you can separate objects after joining them. I do use these tips with my own geometry when I join them and separate them, but it's usually something that I use with resources I get externally. And knowing these tips help me use other designers or other artists' objects without finding it too difficult to incorporate into my own projects. Now, another thing I do is parent objects. So this is joining them physically as one object, but what if I only want them to follow per location? So if I want to animate a part of the mesh without creating keyframes for everything, let's say I wanted to animate part of my project, but I have other things that I want connected to it that I want them to, let's say, rotate, like in this project. I wanted all of these wooden poles to be connected to the hexagon in the middle, and then each of the books and the text and the bees to be connected to the poles so they follow the rotation. So what I did is parented those poles to the hexagon and then parented each of the components for each of the poles to those poles. And the poles are joined as one object. Now let's say I want to select this separated by selection. And now I want to select all of these and join them. Now I have this screen and I have a round cube. And I want my round cube, let's say I want it to be a part of this weird looking screen, but I don't want to join it. Let's add another one. Now our screen has ears. Also, let's shade smooth everything just because it bothers me when they're not. Now I want to animate this, but I want these to follow without adding another set of keyframes for these, because if I wanted to change the animation of this one, or I wanted it to follow a noise curve, like a specific noise curve with specific values, I don't want to repeat that process for each of the ears. And that's where parenting comes in. So if I go and select these 2, and then I select this one last, this, the active one, is going to be the parent. And if I hit Command P, I get set parent to. You can definitely go to object, parent, and then set the parent over here. You're going to find a lot of things for armature and bones and curve, deform, and following a curve, because you can easily animate on a curve by just parenting it to a curve. But what I like to do is just hit Command P, definitely Control instead of Command on a Windows. And then you either choose object or you choose object and keep transform if you have certain transformation for these. And then I never really used any of the other ones. Vertex, I want to test out before I can give you a tutorial on, because I want to test it with cloth simulation as well. So that is going to hopefully be something exciting that I achieve in the coming weeks. But for now, we're going to set parent to object. The difference between joining objects with Command J and joining object using parenting is that if you toggle this, you can see the 2 different objects inside of your parent. So it gives you a tree of how these things are parented. So if you have something parented to this round cube, it's going to be inside of its own toggle. And it's going to show you the child of a child of a child, depending on how many times you actually parent something. So for my project, the one I showed you, it's actually 2 different parents. So I have a grandparent, a parent, and then the final child which are the components for each of the poles. And then the poles are joined, so they're one object, and then they're parented to the hexagon in the center that actually rotates. And now if I go to the object properties and I set a keyframe for the location, and then I go to the 30th frame or whatever frame, and I move it on the x-axis, insert another keyframe. Now everything is moving with the parent. What if you want to delete that now, the parenting, and return everything to its original form? I can just hit delete keyframes on the first frame because that's my initial position. Hit X, delete keyframes. Oh, before we do that, if you do change or animate this part, it's not going to do anything to the parent. But let's say now I want to move this. It's going to move with it with the position that I set it to. So the position of the children are dependent on the position of the parent, but the parent isn't dependent on the position of the children. So you can move the children to wherever you want, and you'll still keep them connected to the parent wherever the parent goes. Meaning if I wanted to fix the position of this, let's say I want to move it a little bit inward, it's not going to change anything for the parent, even if it's animated. Now to clear the parent, just select it and hit Option P, clear parent, or clear parent and keep transformation. If you do clear parent and you have moved the position of the parent from the initial position, these are going to go back to their original position. So let's say I have this moved to here. And now I want to clear the parent. I hit Option P or Alt P on Windows, and I say clear parents. These are going to go back to their original position because they only follow the parent because I said so. But if I said clear parents, then they don't have any parent to follow, so they're going to go back to their original position. But let's say I changed my mind. I don't want to parent it, but I only wanted to do it temporarily to move my parent with the object set here. But now I want to release the parent, so I can just hit Option P. However, I want to keep the new transformation. So I can just clear and keep transformation. That will keep them where the parents took them. And now we have all of the objects separate from each other. Finally, let's talk about why I actually joined Mesh. With parenting, as I said, it's just to make animations much easier, and it's more efficient that way. I mean, why would you want to create the same animation for everything? If the rest of your objects are going to follow one main object, then why not parent it instead of creating keyframes for the different ones? You can also parent a secondary object to your main object and then create a secondary animation for your child. So maybe add an F-curve modifier to the child so it's moving and rotating around itself, but following the general movement of the main object. But why do I join Mesh with Command J? I mean, if it's going to have different materials, why join them? It just makes things much easier for me to move stuff around. And it also reduces the amount of things I select. So let's say I have a plane, rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees, go to the front view, increase this. This is going to be a background. One of the things I struggle with the most when it comes to something like this is whenever I select an object in the foreground, it always selects the background by mistake. And let's say I have a lot of objects on here, and let's say I have a different object in the front. If I wanted to select this one, but I didn't see that there is an object in front of it, it'll select this object rather than the object in the back. But if I have multiple ones, and let's say I didn't join them and I want to move them together because they're kind of connected, and I want to select things in the background, I have to go one by one for each of these. Also, you can toggle certain things over here that are not toggled by default. If I turn on the selectable and I want to freeze all of these so they're not selected, I'm gonna have to go to all of them and do this. And then I'm gonna have to go back and select everything to be able to select all of these. But if I have them joined, now it's just one button to click and I freezed it, and now I can go back to it. And if I want to move anything here, I can just make sure that nothing is selected and then hover over it, hit L, and then move it. So it simply makes things easier for me when I work, especially when things are much smaller than this. Like for this project, for instance, all of these lights are a hassle to edit if they're separate objects. So I just joined them, and then if I wanted to tweak them a little bit, I can just go into edit mode and select linked and then move them around. Also, I do it for easier cloth simulation. You might have already seen this in my previous tutorial. It should be public by now. When I did the text cloth simulation, I joined all of them, and that way it made my cloth simulation much easier to handle, because then I can just turn on self-collision rather than add collision to each of the letters, which was going to make my workflow much longer. And also I found that self-collision is much nicer than object collisions with the cloth simulation. And it just became a habit that I join objects before I apply a cloth simulation to them. Another thing, which is why I called this cloud in the beginning, because I wasn't planning on creating this screen until I remembered how I use by selection. I was just going to show you how you can separate by selection just based on the separate objects. And so I created this. But let's say I want to create a cloud. One thing I do, instead of using metaballs, which connect to each other by default, I do this. If I go into edit mode, select linked, and make them look like a cloud. Now I have this cloud shape. I can go to the modifiers tab, add a modifier, and then add a remesh modifier. And this is how I sometimes create my clouds. Now you can add hair particles to them. For fuzzy clouds, you can use the volume material to make them a little bit more realistic. You can go with smooth, but usually with something like this, I go with voxel. And then I make the value a lot bigger just because I'm trying to join the geometry into one big mesh. And now if I have a subdivision surface, and you cannot shade smooth when you have the remesh because it has a check for smooth shading. And now you have a cloud and it's editable. So you can go with this one, select, rotate it a little bit, bring it forward. And that's another reason why I join mesh. And that's pretty much it for joining and separating objects. I hope you enjoyed this and found it really helpful. If you have other tips for joining and separating objects, please leave them in the comments below. It does help me to see those comments in creating the upcoming videos. I've gotten a few comments that are extremely lovely, and they are quite helpful because they gave me insight into what the videos need and what is successful in them in the first place, and that I need to continue. So yeah, the comments are always very helpful, and I believe it does help the channel as well. So that's a bonus. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.